Welcome to our podcast. Today we're tackling the subject of fear and anxiety, and we're asking questions. Where does it come from? How do we manage it? What's it all about? We live in a world that's so fast-paced these days. Everyone's moving 90 miles an hour. We have access to information like never before. In fact, it's information overload, and we see things in real time. Combine all that with coming through a pandemic when people's lives were changed dramatically. Even in the world of work, people didn't leave, they stayed home, and some people lost jobs. We didn't go anywhere. And so it's not surprising that research is indicating anxiety levels are higher than ever in all populations, even in adolescents, which brings to light a whole other topic of folks using social media in a way that's increasing anxiety by the comparisons and the criticisms and not measuring up and feeling like you have to compete. So lots is happening out there that we think is actually contributing to increasing fear and anxiety. Bill, initial thoughts on that?
When I think of fear, I think of it as a helpful friend. It can be, or it can be an enemy. The friend part is that fear is that tap on the shoulder to get our attention, but it should never, in the final analysis, direct our steps. We need to have a perspective where we take everything into consideration, how God made us, what He's called us to be, what's the assignment of the day, and not let negative self-talk put us under fear.
It's interesting when you say that. I remember hearing that the most often uttered commandment in Scripture is fear not. So what does that tell us? It tells us that God knows we're people who are prone to fear. Fear is a common feeling. It's a common condition. And in that regard, we should not allow those feelings, in a sense, to criticize ourselves over them, to internalize that view that because we're afraid, we're weak, we're inadequate. They're just feelings. And as you're saying, while those feelings are real, we don't want them to control us. And as the commandment goes, fear not, with that fear, move boldly forward. Thoughts on that?
I think of Joshua, called by God to fill the shoes of Moses. Pretty big shoes to fill. And he's been faced with very challenging circumstances, to say the least. And 3 times God says to Joshua, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous. And after each one, he says, I will be with you, meaning in strength, I will be with you. And you will succeed in carrying out what I've called you to be about. So if we can identify how God made us and what the expression of that looks like in our work and friendships and other kinds of decision-making areas, God goes with us in strength. If we have fear, that's okay. But again, don't let it be more than a tap on the shoulder to get the attention. Now there's an exception here. Suppose I'm in a place I've never been before, someplace in the world, and I get this gut feeling of fear. And I look around, I don't see anything to be frightened of, but I've got that gut feeling. Under those circumstances, the wisdom is listen to your gut and don't go ahead into potential danger. Go around it. Don't feel like you have to be courageous and walk through something like that.
So part of understanding this whole element of fear is understanding that their feelings, they may be lying to us, we should go boldly forward, but they also might be telling us the truth. Sometimes that feeling is stop, pay attention and see what's going on. And sometimes we don't get a postcard telling us which it is. And so you have to be careful and discerning. So we don't want fear to hold us back when it shouldn't, but we want it to cause us to stop and take notice if our gut is telling us something's not right here. I think of stories we've heard of, for example, a woman who went into her apartment, she had her key in her hand, she was ready to open her apartment door and had that feeling, that intuitive fear. And she turned and looked, and lo and behold, some ways down the hallway was a man approaching her who most likely would have caught up and pushed her in the door and followed her, in fact was arrested later. So we don't want to just dismiss those feelings out of hand. They may be telling us the truth. An example of them not holding us back, though, and being the strong and courageous part, we think of the clip we saw on YouTube, a little girl who was going skiing and for the first time was standing at the top of the hill wanting to go down, and her voice was trembling, and she was trying to talk to herself into going, I can do it, I know I can do it, and your heart just went out to her because you could tell she was terrified, but then she went down with a dad behind her calmly saying, you can do this, you got it, and then a scream of exhilaration because she overcame that fear and had success. So it's discerning what that fear is about, but then not allowing it to hold us back, and also at times taking a moment and saying, maybe this is telling me something I need to pay attention to. Now, what about anxiety? Anxiety is sort of a twin to fear, but it can be different. Any thoughts on that?
I think with anxiety, I know there are different types of anxiety, and you, as a professional counselor, have addressed those many, many times. But I think under the anxiety of the type I'm thinking of, the person in their heart of hearts is making a prediction. And the anxiety is about the outcome that they fear. Mm-hmm. And so there, I think they need to learn to talk to themselves. I think this will be a very small example, and maybe something that in its type or kind a lot of people can identify with. But when I was 12, we're on vacation, and there's a pool with a high board, a board that to me looked very scary. But I said in my heart of hearts at the beginning of the week, by the end of the week, I'm going to dive off that board, no matter what. So I made the hard decision, but the rest of me hadn't caught up yet. So I did a little put your toe in the water to test it kind of thing. I go up the ladder to the high board. Not very bold here. I go down and I crawl out to the end of the board and look down, which the water seemed so far away, and then backwards. I was so frightened I wasn't going to turn around on the board. I went backwards, crawled backwards, went down the ladder, and I said to my brother Bob, 6 years younger, so a little guy, and I said, Bob, you ever thought of diving over that board? I was sort of kidding. He's just a little guy. No fear. He goes up the ladder, goes up to the edge of the board, and dives off. I couldn't believe it. By the end of the week, I did it. But I think if you can take on the little things, it kind of builds a confidence in your perspective and saying, you know, I have some insight here, and I don't have to bow to my anxiety and my fear.
Yes, and your example with you and your brother Bob, it just brings to light as well, we're all different. And like it or not, some people, whether it's life experiences, internalized core beliefs, something genetic, do experience more anxiety. In this case, with the diving board, you had more than your brother.
Much more.
And
he had none.
He had none. And some people, for some reason, seem to come into the world feeling more anxious about many things than other people do.
And that's okay.
And it's okay. And a friend of mine, in speaking about anxiety, encourages people with a lot of anxiety to consider anxiety as their little friend whose hand they're holding as they walk down the street. And they can take care of that little friend, but that little friend's not going to control them. And that's what you're indicating. Even though that anxiety is there, it doesn't have to control us. There's some steps to take to try and manage those things that we're anxious about. Oftentimes it's you got to do it and do it many times, and then you won't be anxious. I mean, that's the best remedy, I think. And even if you go shaking and trembling, knees knocking, you go. And then what you're indicating is the more you do that, now you're building evidence that says you're quite capable of managing these things. And so the next thing that causes anxiety, you see yourself as maybe shaking and trembling, but knowing you'll get through it and come out the other side. So when I think about anxiety, it's there for most of us at some time or another in our lives, for some more than others. We don't want to make it our enemy, make it our friend, and we want to learn from it. But more than anything, it's seeing yourself as capable of managing whatever comes down the pike. Not always alone. We have people on our team, resources, people we consult with. We don't have to go it alone. But anxiety doesn't have to control us when we see ourselves as able to manage whatever comes down the road.
A little bit of a tangent comes to mind. I think of the research that has addressed small children, say 4 or 5 years of age, that seem to be more anxious than is typical. And what they found there is if the parent can really work on making those predictable connections day after day and begin to develop a deeper sense of intimacy with the child, then that child tends to be more bold. So relationship, within relationship with God, also relationships with
the whole idea
people.
of not being a lone ranger. When we kind of isolate, don't share our feelings with other people, don't let people know what we're dealing with, we're being that lone ranger. It's a much harder task when we're allowing people in on what we're dealing with, asking for help, they go with us. That does build strength. It makes us feel not alone, and it can be a great technique for overcoming anxiety. We don't want anxiety to run our lives. We want to see anxiety as an emotion that we can understand. And oftentimes it's important to say that very thing I'm anxious about, if that very thing happens, what's going to be the worst outcome?
Yes, it's a real good question to ask.
Yeah.
I think a question for anyone who's listening to what we're talking about here, what is your level of confidence about the life things that you have to take on day by day? What kinds of predictions are you making that might stop you in your tracks when in fact you could easily continue to go forward? And so with all of us, what is standing in your way or my way because of how I'm thinking? Something that God would have us take on, that He's equipped us for, maybe surrounded us with supporting people in some cases. Be strong and courageous.
And it's again a reminder, that very thing that we're anxious about, do a little bit of history. What are the things I've already gone through? What are the things I've managed? What are the difficulties I've overcome? That's the evidence that says, well, why can't I take on this next thing? To see ourselves accurately, and again, that puts those feelings in perspective and doesn't allow them to control us. We make the choice to move forward based on the evidence we have that we can manage that thing. And it's solid evidence, and so we want to use it in our favor. Well, we hope this has been helpful. Thanks for tuning in.